Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening for those of you who are across the country. Um, my name is Emily Zayden, and I'm so pleased to have Lauren Verdugo and Martin Alexander here today to talk about their work. Just want to mention that the exhibition that they're part of, Building Blocks, is open closing this Saturday, and it's also fully accessible on craftinamerica.org. Even beyond this Saturday, the virtual will be up and available. So please do check it out. Some excellent work. And the group of artists who were part of the exhibition were consulted and filmed for the formation of our craft video dictionary, which is available at craftdictionary.org. And I'm sorry, craftvideodictionary.org. And these artists demonstrated all kinds of techniques that are defined in their videos. So please check that out as well. And so we're going to begin today with Martin. We've got Lauren joining us from the East Coast in Pennsylvania, and Martin is here in Los Angeles. And so pleased to have both of you. There's so many interesting connections and parallels between you, and we'll talk about that later. And you're both going to be talking about both your conceptual approaches to wood furniture, and both of those as sculpture as well as functional objects. And very pleased to have your perspectives with us today. So I
Thank
will
you so
pass
much.
off. Yes, I will pass off to you, Martin,
All right,
first.
thank you, Emily. Really excited to be on the talk, and thank you for including me in the show. But so for this talk, I think it would be helpful to kind of do a chronological um, uh, showing of past work, the work that's in the show, and then what I'm working on now and as I go into grad school. But let me go ahead and bring up the PowerPoint. So yeah, Martin Alexander, you can call me Martin. And he, him, my studio is in Los Angeles, in Allied Woodshop, which I'm a big part of. And so with my practice, I started at Cal State Long Beach, where I kind of developed my skills and also kind of learned more conceptual art, where it is how I kind of combine my studio practice altogether. So in undergrad, I started in 2018. And so I'll be kind of going through old works, current works, and how that all kind of ties in together. But at Cal State Long Beach, I kind of investigated different forms of making between wood and CNC objects. So I kind of wanted to look at some sculpture work, such as Joseph Kosuth here, which is pieces based off of 1 and 3 algorithms. So it's heavily invested in Rhino, which is what we all kind of develop a lot of our furniture in, and thinking about how in this digital era, how it informs a lot of the making we do. And so I kind of put the concept of designing in the digital space conflicted with the idea of a chair with the construction of a chair. And so how that culminated is with the definition on how we think about a chair, the printout of what that rendering looks like in Grasshopper, which is the interface you use to design, and then of course the object itself. And now I didn't necessarily intend to base the aesthetics off of Sam Malouf or Sergio Rodriguez. It was just kind of happenstance, but kind of thinking about the relationship on how these makers sort of use their own ideas to cultivate the design, as opposed to working in the space. I was just working within the parameters of the program itself, and how these all sort of interrelate was really fascinating to me. And so that was one of my more favorite successful pieces in undergrad. 3 other ones I'll quickly kind of go over that I worked with was thinking about craft history and kind of the relationship with scarcity. And so what I did with this piece was look at cutouts from Sotheby magazines and thinking about how we place value on these objects, be it its cultural relevancy, but also in the commercial market. So I created also these silhouettes that end up kind of being signifiers for what these kind of things kind of hold on into our public imagination of what craft is, at least in the respect to furniture. And then with that, I had the definition of a silhouette, kind of thinking about those sort of relationships. So I'm really deeply embedded of like thinking I want to work with skill. I want to work with traditional craft, but I don't want to be a barefaced replicator of objects historically. I kind of want to do a meta critique on what I am sort of experiencing and learning about at this time. This was a piece about the materiality of live edge. This is a piece of photocarpus from Long Beach campus that had a rubber tube, kind of the tree grew around it, and thinking about how we also privilege live edge as being organic, and it's reflected in the silhouette of that original piece, and how you kind of stare and take it in on like how that nature has its own organic beauty. And then the hose sort of representing man's interaction with it, but nature overcomes it. So that was kind of a conceptual piece also. And finally, this one was thinking about George Nakashima and his work with book matched pieces, and how a lot of book matched pieces kind of have this psychoanalytic approach to it in regards to a Rorschach test. So you can see it's bisected in the middle, and you kind of stare at it, and deep thoughts come out as you stare at it. And I think, at least want to believe, that George Nakashima was possibly thinking about it. And so that's kind of where this piece kind of stems from, was just not just thinking about the replication of object, but how does it kind of fit into more of a conceptual aspect. And so that was more of my earlier work that I had to put a pause on after. And if I could describe my timeline, it's sort of episodic. So this was kind of pre-COVID, if I'm going to kind of place it. And so before COVID, I had not produced any work, but had many running thoughts. And so I'm an artist that over time has a library of thoughts to work with. And then when I have access to CNCs, machinery, a wood shop, I can then pick and choose what I want to produce. And so in the time of COVID is when I actually was able to have more time in the wood shop to develop or actually make more pieces. And so this is one of the pieces in the show called All Eyes on You. It's kind of based off of James Krenov style cabinetry, even though I'm not trying to fully replicate it. But those that know about his work could kind of somewhat identify it as such. And so I'm kind of still pulling from that, at least West Coast craft history, which is, of course, what I'm sort of embedded in and what I relate to. But also the conceptual aspect of this piece was that thinking about furniture as something alive, something that if everyone has furniture that kind of travels with them as they move from place to place, it becomes almost a pet of sorts. And so I kind of anthropomorphize this object by including eyes, thinking about how eyes sort of are windows to the soul, or like they kind of give it more of a human aspect that you can stare at. So on these close-ups, you can see I had these eyes sort of milled into them and hand sculpted after the fact. And so kind of the viewer hopefully was kind of thinking about objectivity in regards to just not a static thing, but there is essence possibly to these objects that we kind of carry throughout our life. Next piece in the show, excuse me, titled Florecita. And this was thinking about community was kind of the starting point. Further back is that my grandmother had recently passed away, and I wanted to honor her memory, but I didn't really know how to connect it. I just didn't really want a painting. I wanted something a little bit, I don't know, conceptual. So at the time I was restoring hand planes, and I was an avid collector restoring old Stanleys. And what kind of occurred to me is that you can paint on these. And so what other community uses paint in their practice, and also to memorialize loved ones, is the lowrider community. Now, I'm not in the lowrider community in any way, shape, or form, but I know that that community is very open, more or less, to collaborating. And so I was able to get in contact with Jacqueline Valenzuela with producing this painting for my object to commemorate the memory of my grandmother. Florecita is her name, and of course that means little flower in Spanish. And so she created this design for the hand plane to kind of act as like a commemoration for her memory. And then I created box for it to kind of be protected. And so it's kind of still working with concept, but then also kind of very traditional woodworking with the spline box in this regard. And then off this kind of same era, as I was still making hand planes, I worked with Jacqueline's husband, Mark Hokut, to create more hand planes based off other ones I had. So this is in his style of lowrider paint, which I use these hand planes any chance I can. And I think it really feeds into this kind of customization, just like in the lowrider community as a woodworker is really cool connection there. And also being in LA, it's just kind of the atmosphere of creativity. And so moving on to the next piece, Amoeba, this is a mixture of going back to my digital work, working in Rhino and Grasshopper and seeing what forms I can make, but also community where I'm also a person that kind of collects things. And so part of that is collecting wood. And so this piece of wood itself is given to me by Angel City Lumber. And so just kind of working with things I kind of come into contact with, I think feeds into the kind of essence of the piece itself. It's a piece of live oak, I believe from Descanso Gardens, but kind of it was going to get thrown out. I want to reuse it. And once I kind of applied this digital rendering to it, you kind of see how it interacts with the material of the wood itself. You see that rust spot on the top, and then kind of its natural cracking gives it real original character in that. And so that was just kind of a piece I kind of produced while I had access to in CNC. And so Gola, I believe, is the final piece in the show. And Gola, I think, was towards the end of this kind of COVID episode of I've never made a self-portrait, be it painting or illustration, but I wanted to kind of think about how can I make a self-portrait out of a wooden object, because that's where I'm at now. And so Gola represents a former identity I had as a soccer player mixed with my current identity as a woodworker, furniture maker, and a crafts person, basically making a handmade indoor soccer goal. And so I hand cut all the joinery for the frame and then hand tied the knot. And this acts as a self-portrait for myself currently and in the past. And so now to kind of like from then on until now in grad school, what I'm kind of thinking about is my relationship to nature and how I affect it as a woodworker. It's such that no longer seeing wood as a commodity, but as a living thing, to not simply be commodified. And so I started investigating mycelium, which is the cultivation of mushrooms, as an avenue for sculptural production, because there's little to no ramifications or consequences to using mycelium. And so this was kind of also learning a new skill, basically cultivating mushrooms was really interesting to me, basically becoming a citizen scientist in mycology. And so kind of this is a piece that is supposed to be a side table, but it's semi-functional, but it was one of my more successful grows, which I'm really excited to kind of show everyone this in this first time in a kind of interview setting. But this kind of reflects my current trajectory of not necessarily giving up wood, but really considering the impact my past practice may have had utilizing wood, and where I can kind of start to take the next steps of getting away from just a wood dominated practice. And I believe that is the conclusion of my presentation.
All right. That was
Thank you
awesome.
so much. We're going to pass over to Lauren, who I just want to mention both of you both teach as well as are in the process of obtaining your MFAs. So another angle that maybe we'll touch on after you present.
Awesome.
All yours, Lauren.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am Lauren Verdugo, they, them. I'm coming to you from Pennsylvania, as Emily mentioned. I just recently ended up at George School, which is a Quaker boarding school in Newtown, which is excellent. They have only had 5 woodworking teachers. So it is very interesting to be a part of a new legacy, considering how I used to be a part, not just kidding, used to, continue that legacy of Sam Maloof and Larry White's work, who is also in the show. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. Here we go. I even put it in Pacific time for everybody missing home. All right, so this is actually Larry's backyard, so I'll mention that guy a lot. And like I said, this show is very interesting in the sense that because it's West Coast centric, everyone knows each other. The woodworking community is exceptionally small. So as we go through this, you'll instantly hear some connections. So and one thing that has always been something that Larry has said, whether it be, someone in a class in a workshop, I'm helping them with something and they end up nicking something, it'll all shape out. We can always just use a rasp and sand it out and it'll all work. So over time, when I first got through community college, I was still trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I was working at the Maloof Foundation, which I started when I was in high school. And then I ended up full circle moment taking over that educational program to work with high school students for over 10 years. So that was amazing. And just seeing firsthand how much art really does shape and encourage students to kind of, vouch for themselves and find, self-esteem at a time where self-esteem is very hard to come by as a high school student. But anyways, working with them, I ended up sticking around, put a lampshade on my head and just stuck myself in that historic home and was able to create an entire wood shop from scratch with Larry White in 2018. So from 2012 to 2018, I was doing a bunch of work there. And then we started doing a full-on educational program, bringing people in and teaching them from there. So I originally started teaching retired architects and engineers and people like that. So what a way to start as a young person, right? All right, so let's keep moving on. I am currently on a break from Cal State Long Beach, which also has a tremendous craft history as well as a state school. But anyways, this is the guy I was mentioning earlier. So he worked with Sam Maloof and started with him at 19. I started working with Larry at 19, so it's very interesting. And it's funny, he was pre-med, found out he didn't like blood. What do you know? So he ended up having the career person at their office at Chaffey College, which I also went to, small world, said, you know what, there's this guy up the street that makes chairs. Would you be interested in making chairs? And he was like, sure. So Sam was already famous at the time. And he was living in the suburbs of LA. So that's where I grew up. And so that was only 10 minutes from my high school. And so getting to know and understand like a craft legacy since back then has been unreal now, considering that I'm able to pass that on to the students I teach. But anyways, just woodworking as a lineage is very interesting. And in terms of fusing art and craft together, this is my first two pieces I ever made, Dawn Redwood, that came from the LA Arboretum. And Lucky Baldwin, I believe, is one of the handful of people that were planting those. But these were down trees that needed to be put into a show called Forces of Nature, where they gave all this wood that had fallen from the Arboretum to over 150 artists. And this was in the first live auction where they only picked 10 artists to be a part of. And this was my very first show. And so that was very encouraging at the time. And so on the right, we have one of Larry's pieces. I was working with him. I was like moonlighting. Had 3 jobs, going to community college and all those things. Still working at Maloof, but I was determined to learn. So I stuck it out and worked with Larry what felt like full time for 4 years roughly. Then I ended up back at school to finish my degree because we figured you can't just run on referrals, right? So you need to actually have something to back it. This is some of my first pieces of casework. I love found objects. You'll see that as we keep rolling, I'll get a little faster. This is a giant book that was donated to the library I worked at, and it's actually an archived New York Wall Street Journal entire newspaper. That's the size of it, is like if you were to open a newspaper. I sealed it shut. If you were wondering if you could open it, you can't. You had from like 1952 till now to open it. So anyways, but yeah, and so the piece is called The Times They Are a Changin'. And you can take that just as a Bob Dylan lyric. This is in my investigation of trying to apply some of my design aesthetic to Maloof style construction. So if you're familiar with woodworking, these may look familiar in terms of how the seat is made. And this form has evolved over time. You know, this is one of those things that because it was early on, the scale's just slightly smaller, right? So as you're learning, it's just like, there's always something, but they're pretty, I think. So there you go. So I learned all the shaping, all the techniques that, you know, Sam was known for using routers and surface edge treatment and things like that. So having a more mid-century, I guess, style legacy, instead of it being more traditional where it's like 19th, 18th or 19th century, like reproduction or anything like that. It was set on the West Coast, you know, so it's kind of interesting that way. I used mostly walnut up until I started using urban hardwood that came from places like Street Tree Revival or Lumber Cycle. And that's just taking, you know, wood that would otherwise be chipped and turning those beautiful and graphic boards into pieces of furniture. And so it's also closing that carbon footprint because, you know, as we have to move wood around, you know, it takes transportation, you know how it works. So this piece right here is called Seed of Reflection. It's the last piece I made before the start of the pandemic. I was literally delivering it to a show that started as the pandemic started. And so this piece is essentially a self-portrait showing that, you know, of all the things you go through when someone's sitting in it, you don't see it, right? It's just a walnut chair. When you walk around it, when you get up and walk around, you see that there's only a handful of things that actually got through it, right? So it's just, you know, a metaphor for just my life up until that point. And I think that I love that. So miss that chair. So this piece right here is actually the only piece I was able to make during COVID because I didn't have a shop. I was doing furniture restoration for mid-century fancy foo-foo pieces all over San Diego in people's garages. And so in my spare time, I was just making smaller work. So this is all hand-cut joinery at the bottom. That was two compound angles. So that was very challenging. But obviously, because it was COVID, I had a lot of time. During that time, also, I was making small scale maquettes as, you know, I was getting, you know, people wanting to order things in the future. I was able to at least make minis. And so here's the mini of this table and chair set. And that's the full scale. And so working with scale models has been something I really find to be exciting because, you know, at least you get to have it and then move it around, see if you were to like crank the numbers up, how big it would be human scale. So kind of going through the process, small scale helps you not mess up with really expensive, beautiful pieces of wood that you did not mean to cut that short, right? This is some Torrey pine that came from San Diego. I went to San Diego State to get my bachelor's, like I mentioned before. And while I was down there, as Martin mentioned, we collect things. And so wood is one of those. And this actually, speaking of fungus, this is spalted and has blue stain fungus going through it. And that's essentially how this Torrey pine died. Torrey pine is a very rare pine tree that only grows off the coast of California and San Diego. And so this form is inspired by sheep shears. So that, you know, very primitive looking sheep shear. That's what this is. And I figured a tractor top would go with a sheep shear ID. So, all right. And then also during COVID, I was able to get a California Arts Council grant to start doing women's workshops to provide a space where people who maybe didn't want to have a potential know-it-all, right? Because you know, you don't want to interrupt or sometimes ask a question that might be seen by everyone else as dumb. And so it's kind of like just giving a very level playing field where no one is there to hear themselves talk. They just want to learn in a opinion-free environment. So this is just trying to open it up to more underrepresented groups in woodworking, and Maloof had never done that before. So that was a first, and that was great. And of course, during COVID, we had masks on, right? Over here, at Allied, this was before we moved locations. So as Martin mentioned, he's at Allied. I worked there, unfortunately worked, but now I get to have all these great pictures of all the students I got to teach. And the students are incredible in terms of diverse backgrounds. I mean, what they do is a real job, and then what they do when they come in and want to work with us is pretty amazing. Everywhere, ranging from a Boeing test pilot to, like I said, retired architects to people who you would never think would end up wanting to try woodworking. So here, and we also had someone who was like a 911 call center person, and they were like, "This is so relaxing." I'm like, "I'm sure." So, anyways, this is a tables class that we did shortly after COVID. Here's more work from that time period with walnut yet again. I had a stash left over. So here's all that. The one on the left is called Leg to Stand On. The one in the middle is called In the Crosshairs. And the one on the far right is called One Night Stand, because not for any subversive reasons. It was only called that because at that point, this was the very first nightstand I had ever made. So, you know, it's punny. It comes with the territory of woodworking. But my idea of making furniture and having the experience of making very expensive, heavy, bold, you know, like kind of dominating furniture in a room for somebody else, I then shifted to, okay, what can I carry up the stairs? Like, what if someone bought this who lived in an apartment? What if someone like myself, what if I'm making furniture for me and I want it to make sure it fits? So I kind of, I guess this is just kind of coming from a place of just make it modular because you've had to like carry so many things up the stairs that you totally forgot that you should not have glued. But anyways, yeah, part of woodworking is also knowing how to move furniture upstairs in LA. This is Monterey pine, and this piece is called Rocky Raccoon for no other reason than it just looked like that's what its name was. Oh, so Monterey, Torrey pine at the base of California, Monterey at the top. So this just has a slight variation in like very rich orange. But besides that, blue stain fungus affected it the same way. I was obsessed with all the knots in it. So anyways, moving on. Bookcase and just some a piece of live edge that I wanted to fold up in some way. It was an interesting piece of urban hardwood. I think it was pecan. So, you know, just fun trees that I would have probably drove past in LA. Just, you know, I tried to just like, you know, translate that into furniture. Same thing with this. The top is Indian rosewood that comes from a contract out in Arizona with Street Tree Revival that was outside of like a mobile home complex. So, you know, these are exotic hardwoods that grow in other countries and sell here for insane amounts of money. And this actually is just a street tree as a decorative thing in Arizona, right? So just kind of reframing and kind of keying into the fact that when you drive through town, you are in an urban forest. So there's that. And also like all the nasty black staining that's from the gross street water and all the metal particles that the tree is taking in as it's growing. Okay, so I'm going to start getting much faster. So this right here is small scale minis of the Whittier Conservancy tree project or tree rescue project. So the Whittier Central Public Library had to close down. They were expanding and they wanted to return the mid-century library back into what its former glory was, because it was a famous architect who did it. And so with that, they were allowed to extend the children's library, and they had to take out this gorgeous tree that had been there for over 60 years. And so they asked me to make stools for that children's library section, and yeah, so the kids could still sit on the tree or interact with that tree that used to be there. So there's that. So here's the minis, and those are little tiny Dr. Seuss erasers. These are some examples of how I was planning on making multiples, just kind of an intro into production. And then this on the right is what it looked like when they asked me. They had just barely started. And then also 2022, after COVID, was much more wound down. I did a Architectural Digest video with their custom crafted series on YouTube, and they asked me and my friend Alex Sue to take a normal folding chair and transform it into a custom crafted chair. And so this is just a little photo of that. You can find that on YouTube if you're curious. So there's that. And that was actually filmed in the beautiful 10th floor machine room at Allied shortly before we moved out of there into a new space in Alhambra, which is much easier to get to. So here's that chair on the roof of the Allied Crafts building in downtown. That's where the name comes from, by the way, that Allied Crafts building. And it was actually, fun fact, that building was founded and built by the first woman banker that ever was on the West Coast. And I think that's pretty cool. Florence Kessler. Anyways, moving forward, here's some more work. Little cat tower in the middle I made with my friend Lisa Nguyen. And she was out in Penland. Now she's in New York again, doing some amazing work out there. And that was in response to us going to Yosemite. And so it's called a Mariposa stool. The lid pops off, but she has a cat that she loves a lot. And so that was kind of the reason why we made a cat tower. Okay, here's this guy as well. It's called Pins and Needles. And it just looked like it was walking on pins and needles when I made it. This was an experiment that I made last year during my first year of grad school at Cal State Long Beach. The idea was to have two specific things that you did to a material. And this was for a sculpture class. And so what I chose was my two actions on a very specific material was I'm going to pour glue and I'm going to remove the clamp out of it. So I cast a little tiny C-clamp in glue, and it's about like 18 to 22 layers of glue that I, over the course of 3 weeks, had to build up thin layers in order for it to look like this. And then in order to kind of make reference to Donald Judd and the minimalists and everything, where I'm kind of elevating a very rudimentary sideline character of woodworking, right? Like glue or even a small C-clamp. Those aren't the things you see in this show, right? Per se. I mean, you see it in this work, but I'm saying like the finished pieces, you don't see these little friends interacting. Glue's always hidden. So anyways, just referencing that minimal nature of just like illuminating panels from behind. So yeah. On the left here is a piece that I made. It has a little chair coming out of it. I was making some compositions with some of that urban hardwood to kind of make reference to Kandinsky, and he's a huge inspiration for me, which also Kandinsky was informed by the arts and crafts movement, William Morris for sure. So on the right is a piece I actually made during my art in residency at George School in January. And that piece on top was made by a glass artist. And I was just using some scraps that Carter CO, who just retired from here, had laying around his shop. And so there's that. I try to work with the wood where it's from. So these pieces on the left, this is a piece from grad school, and it's a chunk of blue gum that is staring at a piece of sandstone that was a failed sample, a core sample that I bought in Arizona. And so when you look at the two pieces, they have very similar striations and graphic marks in both the wood and the stone, but it's just they're mimicking each other. And that's essentially what that's about. On the right, again, another piece I made at George School using some soft maple that's spalted. It was so fun. And that walnut, which they do have out here, I'm very spoiled. We will get to work with walnut this year, so that's great. This is a birthing chair that I made in this past year at grad school. And it's made with some spalted and blue stained fungus Torrey pine. And it's in reference to my complicated relationship to my identity. For one, as a woodworker, as a person who's a non-binary person, but also someone who's capable of being raised a certain way and being capable of birth, and that concept being very hard to swallow and have people only see you as a vessel for this, right? So kind of that projection, but also it's referencing my history. My last name Verdugo references one of the first Spanish land grants outside of the California mission system to some, like, my ancestors way back, and they owned everything from like the foothills of the San Gabriels all the way to almost Silver Lake, and down to southern Pasadena. So I think that was wild. But anyways, just to kind of emphasize the Torrey pine relation and relation to the Spanish, and my last name being Verdugo, is Torrey pine was the very first thing that the Spanish saw off the coast of San Diego when they first came over here. And so just that idea and the idea of a Spanish birthing form, this chair is very common if you just look up Spanish birthing chair. This is just my interpretation of it. So it just kind of like, referencing the mycelium as something that is infecting and spreading, right? Just kind of like how Spanish birthing stools definitely brought people who, were colonizing this area and, making people sick, essentially. So yeah, just, making a handshake with my past, or at least my ancestors, and just trying to find my center in that. Anyways, and this was in the show. And then moving on, this is also in the show that I hope everyone got to see. There's a poem that goes along with this. I'm not going to read it to you, but it's California black walnut, and this tree itself actually puts specific chemicals into its canopy. So anything that is around it and underneath the canopy, like in the soil as well, nothing can grow unless it's a native plant. And so I just thought that was significant. When the Spanish saw that we had walnut trees, because they were used to their own walnut trees out there, they hated our walnut trees, which I think are pretty awesome, but they hated that they were multi-trunked. They were so wild and so like giant. So you can kind of see this is a cross section where you feel as if you're sitting at the base of a tree. And so that was the intention here. So you can kind of experience at least the more romantic parts of why California black walnut's awesome. Oh, also, this was the seat frame here was what I used to cut in a demonstration video for the Craft in America video dictionary project that Emily mentioned before. All right, so this is where I am right now, just so you kind of get a little catch up. This is the state of the George School Woodshop. And if you can tell, there's a lot of incredible machines in it. So yeah, this is, it's literally bigger than every single university shop that I've ever been in. So these students have access to all these wonderful pieces of equipment, and it's an amazing legacy. But what's crazy is when I first got there, I noticed that in the very, very back left corner of the room, there was a single Sam Maloof poster. I was like, oh my gosh, it's just like, I can't escape that guy. But anyways, so there's that. And here's another side of it, just from the opposite end of the shop. I've never seen that many one-way lathes, not even at Penland, even though Penland is, whew, it's craft heaven for sure. But anyways, that's pretty much it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren. Excellent. So we have time for some questions and some discussion. And I wanted to start on the front of West Coast furniture. You'd mentioned, Martin, and how that is an influence for you. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And you touched on it as well, Lauren. I think both of you definitely have aspects of your work that would I would identify with that, but I'd love to hear from each of you what you think you take away from your West Coast origins.
So I would say it's just the fact that those are the kind of more or less idols we can look towards to like how we can produce objects, what has been historically privileged, at least on the West Coast, as the Krenov School has James Krenov, the Maloof Foundation right here, basically down the freeway, kind of being figures, like I guess represent us, I guess that are regional, for me at least, but then also like they make really good stuff.
What about you're both to different degrees. Lauren's work veers more into or is based more in the functional for the most part, and your work is much more pure sculptural, just to kind of simplify and synthesize. What about that as far as West Coast approaches to furniture and wood? Does that, outside of the Maloof world, are there other influences that you're looking at that stem from your West Coast roots as well?
Lauren, do you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that, I think that just the nature of art and design, and even with like Arts and Architecture magazine and all that becoming more of a thing with California design over the last like 40 years, that has kind of become a turning point and a pivot for California to start to become some form of something we should look at in terms of like design aesthetic, and even like the case study homes. But things like that, it's very open-ended, and it's much more what's on the horizon instead of let's preserve traditional craft. So in response to the World War II, you get Nakashima, you get Sam Maloof, and they're returning to craft as a means of, oh my gosh, all this industrialization and just like the war and all these things, I need to return to something that will center me. And so that whole idea is I think coming full circle, in the sense that we do use machines and mill wood and stuff like that, but Sam and George was very lucky. He had so many gorgeous trees near him. Sam as well, but they're of a time where there was an abundance, and now there's more of a scarcity. And so I think that as we kind of move forward, it's become more of a conversation of like, is your practice even sustainable? And I think that conversation wasn't, you were trying to sell custom, beautiful pieces of craft furniture to high-end clients to provide for your family. That was their prospects. Even though Sam bent the wood to his will, more so than George Nakashima, there are just, there's just some connections. But in terms of like sculpture, I think that because most of our art related things have to do with universities, and so Martin and I both coming from, I don't mean to speak for you, Martin, but that we both have this background where we're exposed to art from a university perspective, and then we have this like interesting craft, and we're developing craft at school in a very contemplative space that it's like, okay, well, it's a chair, but what else is it? So I think that's something. Do you want to speak to that, Martin?
Yeah, and that's almost exactly what I was going to say was the fact that I experienced art first and learned about his art history first. And then at some point in my college career, that's when I kind of got involved with the wood shop there at Cal State Long Beach, which I found it. I didn't look for the wood shop at Cal State Long Beach. And I feel that Cal State Long Beach has this really interesting local history on connections to the Maloof. I believe some individuals went through the program also in their career. And I just kind of happened to fall into it and just fell in love with it. And then at some point, I really got involved with technical skill mastery, to which I was at some point I was like, okay, I just don't want to make chairs. How do I implement it with the experience and knowledge and sculpture and art that I have? And that's kind of like where I've kind of kept in line for the most part of my career. And it's kind of nice being in the space between skill in a non-skilled space of such a sculpture where it's not necessary. But just from going into grad school now, it's very interesting to consider most of my colleagues right now kind of also interested in reskilling, even though academic institutions have become more or less de-skilled outside of the history of if they're connected to a craft history, such as Long Beach.
Yeah, I think that's a super important topic to touch on the shift in academia from your perspectives as current grad students. And however, you're coming from two Cal State schools, this might not be reflective of the rest of the country, but that they are that the programs exist and that there's the acceptance or support of them, which could change, I don't know, at any point, but that gives you the possibility to explore these materials and techniques. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about what you're both experiencing of the reskilling of craft in your art programs and yeah, what you see among your peers is happening. There's more thoughts you want to add to that, either of you.
Lauren, you should go first because you're a grad student before me.
Uh, okay, so I think in terms of how just craft has become like infused into our school system, it also bookends the classes that we're taking about art theory and Clement Greenberg saying that like technically what we're doing is kitsch. So you have this back end of grad school being gratifying, but also like, oh, actually what I'm doing is not that celebrated historically. So when you're in critique, you know, they're coming from a place of, more not, I wouldn't even say traditional, but I think that like the focus point is on conceptual and what I find distracting is when the piece looks like crud and it's that it kind of devalues what they're trying to say or what they're trying to illustrate. And so I think it's just a matter of striking a balance. And also I think that it's arrogant to assume that you can just take on a whole new skill and say that I'm going to slap $5,000 on it. It's an art piece, because it's essentially giving a middle finger to all the people that have come from that kind of legacy where they've learned. Of course, I don't expect anyone to go and become a bricklayer if they wanted to put a brick wall in the backyard, but I'm just essentially saying that it's. I think that there just needs to be more of a art, craft, and design all should and do hold hands. It's not, there shouldn't be a hierarchy. Um, and I think that the university system's working that out.
Yeah, well, and I think what you're saying as well, it's very hard. There are certain media that are easier for a grad student, an emerging artist to, or an artist of any at any point in their careers to take on would require certain techniques and skill sets that it's very hard to dabble. So maybe that makes them more rarefied in their ways. But yeah, and it'll be interesting to have this conversation. Possibly your perspective will shift in the coming year of East Coast, Lauren, as you're out
Yeah.
there.
It's very interesting because I'm shifting into a Quaker mindset as well, where it's more so everyone goes by their first name. it's much more what the students are interested in. And I think that just kind of meeting students where they're at and, evaluating, how do I balance the celebrated traditions of the rich part of this, beautiful craft scene that's out here, with also, my personal experience. How do I introduce all these different ways, but then also bring it up to a position of like, how can this be relevant to your life? It's not, I don't want to just bring people into a time machine and then they come out with the table. I think I want it to be more of a, I can now apply this to my life. Like, I think that what we're trying to do with craft is just essentially give people an opportunity to make for themselves and to get that confidence of, I just did that. I'm a human 3D printer, basically. I think that just getting people to realize you don't have to just go buy it is kind of like my goal as a teacher. And working slow, even though you're using machines, it's still working slow because you're not just clicking on Amazon, right? You're having to make intentional, thoughtful decisions. And like Martin was saying, it's like these pieces of furniture end up becoming your pets. You're taking them around the world with you, you're passing them down, and that those are all things that I think are from a bygone era, but I think are still very relevant. So it's kind of like, how do I take this and bring it into the future with that as a pivot point?
Great. Gonna switch gears. There's a question for Martin and for both of you who materiality is very important in each of your work and various kinds of materials. But the question is about mycelium, Martin, and is it a growing byproduct? Would love to know also how that plays in with sustainability for each of you, how you're factoring that into materiality in your practices. But would love to hear much more about all of that work, Martin, because yeah, you touched on it, but even technique, are the techniques of woodworking applicable to that? So,
All right. So just to quickly explain what mycelium is it's the root structure of mushrooms, which you give it the conditions to basically grow, and you cultivate it. And there's a whole thing I can go into, but I don't think I should. But sticking to how it applies to my practice now is one aspect I really consider is labor and my labor and how that in turn creates value, and how long I like set how long I work on a project is really important to me. I don't want to overextend myself, but then also what are some ways that I can begin to kind of like with 3D printing and CNC, you can outsource that labor. But I didn't want to go down that route because CNCs and digital fabrication have an environmental toll, but also I just don't have the financial capacity to have those things. But what if I look towards nature, and a printing nature is mycelium. And so my goal right now is to kind of fuse these craft skills such as weaving, woodworking, steam bending with craft, if I can say it's craft cultivation, which for me is new. And I hope to like kind of put it out in the world, this concept of craft cultivation, because I am making this work based off of others people's work, such as Sam Shoemaker and Phil Ross, who kind of were the inspirations in regards to like work they produced. And I think one thing that I don't want to say they were missing, but one thing that I have is a traditional craft background. And so incidentally, mycelium cultivation works well with natural materials such as wood, fiber, and linens. And so I think there's a really sweet spot in between how I can utilize and produce works based off of like skills seen in traditional craft in weaving fused with mycelium kind of sculpture production. And so that's kind of where the direction I want to go towards, because there's the real world considerations of my body can only take so much work and labor, but then also how it would help me to like make these things. What you simply do is you make a framework. It's real reductive, but you make a framework and you apply this substrate of like wood chips, which I use scrap wood chips with the mycelium, and you give it the conditions to basically grow. And so the conditions are basically a very moist environment at 75 degrees. And it can grow from there. So one way you can kind of see this in nature is after a rainy day, you can go lift up a log and you'll see white strands, and that's basically mycelium. But ultimately, the way I kind of view it, it becomes nature's 3D printer because it kind of just starts to form and grow outward, which is from a nature perspective is really cool. But also thinking about how Lauren mentioned Sam was bending the wood to his will, where I don't want to do that. I feel like there's it's overmasculated for my for what I don't want to do anymore in woodworking. Where this is now I'm working in conversation with nature, in conjunction with nature to produce objects, which is an interesting facet I want to start to include into my work rather than cutting down a tree, shaping it to my will, and then, you know, how that kind of plays out versus cultivating and really tapping in with nature in that way.
It's fascinating and so complicated. So yes, thank you for uh, the the shortened version. I know there's a lot more that we could discuss on that front. There's two great questions from Chris Odom. You're starting to touch on for Martin how you use CNC and Rhino in your work, and I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all and how that process goes, whether in reference to amoeba or otherwise.
So that I want to say have given up on digital fabrication or CNC, but I think what was important to me moving forward was not to base my practice off of that, since it kind of required all that infrastructure of space, the machine upkeep and all that to produce it, which I think is good. And at this point is more or less a tool for me now, which I'm not against it and I don't think it's bad, but I would just simply use it if I need to. And just as a preference, I just love working in Rhino and Grasshopper. It's just a fun way to design versus as opposed to other ones where you're kind of like if you worked in Grasshopper, you're not designing as if you're like drawing in space. You're thinking about these different modules and how they connect in a different way. And so that's how I came about the different forms were based off of simply working in Grasshopper as a design restriction. And that's how you kind of get these nice kind of repetitive patterns based off of what's called parametric algorithms.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, this new hybrid that you're creating really of both process and material. Um, let's see, Lauren, and this ties in with another question for you about your plans for your students, but wondering, it might be too soon, but you usually tap into, as you mentioned, local materials very heavily for a lot of metaphorical content and otherwise, but what are you planning? What are your thoughts about being out there and shifting the practice to look at materials there? I think you mentioned spalted maple for students, but for your own practice, then also how that might tie in with what you're going to do with your students.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And also thank you, Chris. That's like huge compliment. And I hope so. That would be wonderful if I can stay here that long. I think that what my plans are to kind of contextualize woodworking in terms of George School itself and where it's at, why our tree is a logo, essentially. What's the point of turning it into something? And so in that process, we do have an amazing like portable wood miser. We have tons of wood that have come from fallen trees on campus. They have the luxury of 244 acres of domestic hardwoods that have been here for a long time. So we essentially have an endless supply, right? And that's why I was saying like George Nakashima was so lucky because he actually is right down the street from where I am. He's only 30 minutes in New Hope. So I think that that's kind of an interesting perspective as well for them to draw that connection to a very local place. But also we working with a portable wood miser on campus and then watching that thing become something that ends up in your dorm room is kind of crazy, right? It used to be outside the window, now it's in your room. And so that's kind of what I want to be the intention of just like introducing novice students to it and like why it's kind of magical. But in terms of like my first projects, there's a lot of students that are starting in between different class modules from where the previous teacher left off. So it's going to be a lot of me getting to know them. I'm going to do a mallet project with the in the middle, intermediate, beginning students that they have to, respond to this mallet project. And I should be able to know that this is your mallet without you putting your name on it. So I want it to be like them decorating it, transforming this mallet that they're going to use every day for chisels and things like that into something that represents them in a cultural form. It can be, their actual heritage, or it could be like, like maybe it's like even a sporting team. It's like anime. It's something like a music, like, different things like that, just to kind of get students interested. And then for the advanced students, I want to, like how Martin was saying, like when you limit certain elements, it forces students to be very creative. And so my idea is for the first project for the advanced students is to have a stool and it be three-legged. That's the parameter. It has to be three-legged, and it has to have a very specific purpose, and it has to be for a specific person. So, and then that's essentially the only two things that tie them to the ground. So, stools can look like anything at this point, right? So, that's where I'm headed. But thank you so much. That was a great question.
Okay, and we're about to wrap up here, but was just curious if either of you both found your ways to wood-based practices, and if you have thoughts about others coming up and how to do that when you might be somewhere that they're less accessible, and how to seek it out to get the access to get hands-on materials and skill.
Lauren?
Oh, okay. So I mean, my number one thing is that if you are in the California area, or at least Southern California area, Ruben Fote, who's in this amazing show, he teaches at Cerritos, and that's one of the best woodworking programs you can get down here. Or I always say that I'm out here. But yeah, out in Southern California. But outside of that wood shop, you can also go to Palomar in San Diego. A lot of community college wood shops are so much better outfitted for people to have like more of an enduring hobbyist thing, because they do open up on the summers to people who want to just have shop access. So that is a great way of getting in. Allied Wood Shop, where Martin is now, you can rent space, or you can, I'm sure I'm going to let Martin speak to the rest of that because I'm not sure what the updated policies are, but finding community is not that hard. Most people can point you in the right direction. If you don't know anything about lumber, go to Street Tree Revival, go to Bonhoff in Vernon if you're in downtown LA, or Angel City Lumber. Those are all places that will not make you feel like you don't know what you're talking about because you only want one stick of wood. So anyways, that's a good place to get started. But I think just reaching out to people is the first step, and like people want to help you if you actually reach out.
Yeah, just reflecting on like how I came into it was not only just reaching out for me, but showing up, physically showing up ended up helping a lot. People get to see your face. And I know classes are sometimes expensive and like somewhat out of reach, but like there is a wave of different spaces at least that are doing sliding scale. I know of that, and we do sliding scale too here. And I don't want to say if it's like too much for people, but like it's an investment. So you do shell a little bit of money if you can. But ultimately, once you have access to like someone you can really talk to and help guide you, kind of stick to them. Just to be like, hey, like like Larry, and yeah, I think that's what's kind of helped me, is just always kind of being involved, saying hi, not being hermetic in my practice, just sticking to the wood shop.
It's great. Yes. Well, thank you. Yes, you both are very resourceful, and also you're always providing a fresh take on what wood and furniture art can be. So thanks to both of you for looking far and wide for your inspirations and making them happen. I think you're great models for pursuing this field and expanding this field in all sorts of ways, as far as practitioners, materials, practices, and all that. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who's attended. And this will be recorded and accessible in the future for anyone who didn't get a chance to see it live. So share that as it's available. Thank you again.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you.